What's up, Wildside besties and baddies? I'm Bailey.
And I'm Chelsea, and we're here to walk you through the wild sides.
From homicides to hosticides and everything in between.
We're so glad you're here, so buckle up
and enjoy the ride.
All right, Wildside, we are here today with Tim Lennon, who is a survivor, a longtime advocate, and the president emeritus of an organization called SNAP, which stands for Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests. But I have a feeling, Tim, that that's not all that you guys do. It looks like you guys dabble in lots of different really amazing things, not just abuse from priests. So we are so excited to hear a little bit about you, about your story, about SNAP. So without further ado, Tim, let us know. Tell us all about Tim.
Yeah, we'd love to hear it.
Alrighty. Well, to start out, how I became an advocate was that I am a survivor of sexual abuse as a child. I was raped and abused by the local parish priest when I was 12. I buried memories of some of the abuse for 30 years. I remembered the most violent abuse took 50 years.
Wow.
I first came into memories in 1995 when I was in San Francisco, lived in San Francisco. I drove past a demonstration at the cathedral with SNAP and stopped, and memories came forward of my abuse over several months of a priest in elementary school when I was growing up back in Iowa. And I became active in SNAP for those 3-4 years and continued on the path of being a supporter and advocate for survivors since that time. And one of the things is part of burying the memories is the injury it did to me as a person. And once I began to heal because of my participation in advocacy in 95 and 98, I had children. And that's an important point because when I had twin daughters and when they turned 12, that evoked the very violent memories of when I was 12. So that the violent rape was so horrific, I had buried it. But when my children were 12, I came to realize the harm that it caused. And that sent me into a great amount of depression, crying, anxiety, which
Sure.
led me to therapy and EMDR therapy, which is incredibly helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So once that happened in about 2010, I soon retired because from work I was kind of a mess. And I had a union job. And in 2010, I basically committed the rest of my life to working as an advocate with SNAP and began volunteering with the national headquarters, doing survivor contact with SNAP, and done that for going on 14 years now, and took on responsibility of being on the board for 10, 12 years, and of course, president of SNAP for 3 years from 2018, 2021. So that's kind of my trajectory from being a victim and burying memories to being an advocate and fighting back. And to me, fighting back is an incredible part of my healing because some studies show that maybe 70% of victims of child sex abuse never tell their story, never share their story.
Mm.
So as an advocate, one of the things I like to do is to bring the issue to public awareness. And thank you for this opportunity to speak about sexual abuse and
Of
child
course.
sex,
Of course.
because it may help someone else understand it's not their fault. They're not alone. They can get better. So all those are important parts of my my advocacy.
And I just want to thank you very much, Tim, for sharing that. My heart goes out to you, especially to the 12-year-old little boy version of you. And I think it's really incredible what you've done with your life to advocate and to help other victims. And I just really appreciate the work that you do.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Fighting back is part of my ongoing healing. So it's important for me to fight back. It's important for me to speak up. When I was a child, as most children, we don't have that opportunity to speak up. We don't have the
Right.
opportunity to fight back. Yeah,
Yeah. And now you get to do it for other people.
thank you. Yes.
So, Tim, when Bailey and I were talking about this, we were talking about clergy abuse, and I have gotten used to letting my ignorance show. It's amazing how much you think you know, and then you realize that you still have a lot to learn. And I was under the impression that the term clergy was specific to the Catholic religion.
Mhm.
And then it was honestly not until we did a quick, look in our dictionary that it says, clergy is the body of all people ordained for religious duties, especially in the Christian church. So it
Mhm.
sounds to me that it's not necessarily specific to Catholicism. So I just kind of wanted to throw that out there for anybody who might be ignorant like I was. My question is, how would you define clergy abuse?
Well, you just gave a definition, which is a good one. So, just as a general kind of background, is predators gravitate to those positions of power where they have the ability to exploit. And so we find that predators go to being clergy, priests, ministers, rabbis, nuns, but they're also coaches, teachers, Hollywood producers, where there's power over other people. So there's a relationship of vulnerability and exploitation. And so within religious organization, in my own case, when I was being abused, the thought was, why is God doing this to me? And to me, I so associated the priest with God, with my faith, with my religion. And of course, the priests, or the clergy that are abusers exploit that, use that power. Same thing with psychiatrists. They use that power over the victim to exploit, to rationalize, to sidetrack, to demean, all the different ways that they can to keep that vulnerability and that power relationship alive. And just as a side note, light, SNAP started out as our priest, as our name priest is in the name of SNAP, started out dealing with just within the Catholic community. But
Uh-huh.
starting about 2010, 2012, we became welcoming to the larger community within faith communities. In other
Mm-hmm.
words, we began embracing victims within Mennonite and Baptist and Jewish communities, all the
Mm-hmm.
different kinds of faith communities. So if you look at SNAP now, probably maybe like at our last convention, we had maybe 200, 250 people. And I would say a third or more were not Catholic within that meeting. That was our national conference. And the percentage may even be higher. In other words, sexual exploitation of children by clergy isn't just in the Catholic Church. And we're seeing giant struggles within the Baptist community and fighting the Southern Baptist Convention, one of the largest organizations of the Baptist community, trying to fight back against their cover-ups and their complicity in sexual violence and covering for sexual predators.
Tim, do you find that sometimes Catholicism as a group is sometimes the scapegoat when it comes to clergy abuse. Like most people associate clergy abuse with the Catholic Church more so than other kind of denominations.
No. I mean, a crime is a crime. And the Catholic Church is known for, and this is up until recently, and I'll get to that a little bit, but the church as an institution has been complicit in sexual abuse of children. And I'll give you my case in particular. The priest that abused me had been caught in 3 parishes previous to coming to my parish. So he had been in two, Danbury, Whittimer, and then Fort Dodge, 3 parishes. The bishop, he got caught. Bishop moved him along each time. He ended up in my parish, raped and abused me. And later, when I did a press conference back in Iowa 50 years after the fact, 15 of my classmates came forward for the first time. So this
Wow.
priest was caught 3 times, moved 3 times, caught in my parish, so that's 4 times, and then moved off. And I even heard stories of other cases of abuse of him, but I have less evidence of that. But meaning that this predator, you know, pedophiles are going to abuse for the rest of their lives. There's not like any kind of cure or anything like that. But the church has been complicit. And my case is not unusual or not uncommon. It is, the practice of the church. The church has seen its reputation as more important and than the safety of its children.
Mhm.
And that it has taken, yeah, just taken that to extremes. But I'll give you another broad, huge example. Pope Francis had made a big deal about sexual abuse in the past and established commissions. I mean, we've had bishops that wash the feet of survivors, have constructed gardens or whatever. But these are all symbolic kind of things. And the Pope
Mhm.
had, I think, 3 different commissions. He's got a new one now, where the initial commission invited a couple of famous survivors, one from England, one from Ireland, and a couple other people I'm not familiar with. But basically, what happened after a couple of months is that and it was the commission was composed of some victims and some clergy and some nuns and whatever. But after a couple months, the victim survivors from England, from Ireland that I know and I'm close to said, it was all a sham, that this church was not going to do anything. And so that commission failed, and they did another one that failed. Now they're in the process of another commission. But, this is all sort of theater. It's sort of, we're dealing with the issue, you know, we're addressing sexual abuse, and it looks good on paper, but are they actually following it? When, I mean, uh, there's so many examples. The bishops in 2002, because the spotlight got exposed for moving predators around and allowing thousands of children to get raped and abused. They established the Charter for the Protection of Children or something like that. I can't remember the official title. It says no more secrecy and whatever. But even today, if you go to bishopaccountability.org, and I suggest everybody,
I have visited that list.
yes, and not only the list, but they have an ongoing blog of different kinds of things. And even today, we
Mhm.
find in news about bishops covering up for priests, of not being transparent. And the reason that they don't do that is they want to protect the power and the prestige of the institution. And again, this is a powerful, the largest maybe institution in the world. And obviously, I've worked with, advocates within the Catholic community, like the people that run Bishop Accountability are very, very Catholic, but they also see the importance of, holding the church accountable. And then there's
Yeah.
the organizations I think I referred to you before Catholic whistleblowers, which are all Catholic priests and Catholic laity who've tried to hold the church accountable about this stuff.
Mhm.
Um, but, so the whole thing is, a lot of bishops and whatever will cry, oh, you're just picking on the Catholics. And I say that's just bullshit. They need to take accountability. They wouldn't use that word, but, they need to take accountability for their own stuff, and they don't. They move priests around, they cover up. I mean, when they had to post, I think there's 160 dioceses or, yeah, that most have published a list of priests who are credibly accused of sexual abuse and as they're listed in bishop accountability. But even so, when like my parish or Buffalo Parish publishes their list of who they say has been credibly accused of sexual abuse of clergy, their list, like in Buffalo, their list was like 12 people. And then a whistleblower came forward and, it's like 60 people. So the
Wow.
church knows about all this stuff. In my parish, this priest was doing a history of the diocese and gave the priest who raped and abused me and abused so many more kids. I mean, 15 came forward. And that means there may be 3 or 4 times as many that never came forward.
Mhm.
Gave a glowing review of this priest, said it was a vile predator. I mean, he was a cruel.
Predator. I mean, yeah.
So the church is, there's some good folks in the church. There's some bishops that are taking, to heart the issue. One of the biggest advocates for survivors is, I don't know if he's a practicing priest, but Thomas Doyle, who has done marvelous work. He was a canon lawyer in 1985, and he and a couple other people did a study for the Vatican saying, hey, sexual abuse of children in the church is an issue, and gave it to the Pope or the commission of the Pope. And then the Pope squashed them and then isolated and penalized the 3 people that were involved in the study. So now the church needs to do a lot, and Pope Francis is not doing anything other than giving names and appointing commissions. When bishops are convicted, or exposed for being predators of sexual abuse, and Bishop Accountability has, 30, 40 bishops that have been accused of that. What the Pope does or the Vatican does is they let them retire. They don't defrock them. I mean, uh, child predators should be in jail, but the church just gives them an out. They'll give them a fancy funeral if they die, but even though they're abused hundreds of kids, it just, you got me on my soapbox when you start saying, well, the Catholic Church, they're picking on the Catholic Church. And I think, well, the church needs to step up. And the issue is 2 different things. And this is an important issue. One is the church does all these cover ups is to protect the institution. And the other thing is they do it is to keep their parishioners uninformed, ignorant of what the scope is. They don't want the parishioners to know that probably 1 out of 10 priests, 16, 20,000 priests are predators. The church wants to keep that quiet from the parishioners. And the other is the parishioners themselves, they need to stand up. I mean,
That was gonna be one of my questions was just maybe as a quick question, do you kind of have an idea of what the statistics are? Maybe we'll keep it simple for now, but just in the United States regarding clergy abuse? Like, what are the ballpark numbers that we're looking at with that we know from what has been reported?
well, there's some statistics on my website, and I'd have to look it up. And it's sort of like, so one statistic I just mentioned that is based on grand jury testimonies of a couple grand juries out east. It's 1 out of 10 priests. And so you can figure out that there's how many priests since World War II
Mhm.
have been active in the United States. And there's,
Mhm.
150,000, 200,000. So that's one statistic. The other statistic is that extrapolating from those public grand jury investigations is that there's probably over 100,000 children or victims of sexual abuse. And that was children, and that's not counting affairs with priests and adult women or married women or whatever that this is just in relation to child abuse. And this is pretty
Mhm.
consistent within what I've seen within other kinds of institutions. I mean, the psychiatrists do the same thing. They protect their own. When there's a complaint about a psychiatrist using their power to abuse a child or to abuse a patient, the psychiatrist, will cover for them. We saw in Hollywood, how power was able to maintain its power for so long. Nasser, who abused, 200 gymnasts, 200 gymnasts. In the University of Michigan, and you could read the stories, University of Michigan administration, the president and other people, head of athletics or whatever, were covering up for this predator. I mean, for decades. So, you can point to the Catholic Church, you can point to any kind of institution, we see the same kind of thing that power wants to maintain and reproduce its power. And any threat to that power becomes paramount. Those abused are, you know, complainers, or it's just a small percentage, or the type to squash it or deny it. And so many women in work situations are intimidated. If you report, you're going to lose your job. Well, if you're a single mom, you got a couple of kids. I mean, that is a real threat. Or if you're on a career path, if you complain, you're never going to make vice president. So intimidation and threats and cover-ups, these are all the different kinds of devices to keep sexual awareness of sexual abuse quiet in modern society. That's what my book is about.
Yeah, no, it's great, and I love your passion for it because that's important. And I think the thing that maybe is extra delicate about this topic specifically with clergy abuse is, maybe it's a silly statement, maybe it's common sense, but from my perspective, it's so much more complex because you've got this concept of a deity, right? Of God and the devil, and that absolutely complicates a victim's perspective, I imagine, of what has happened, right? They were supposed to be in a safe place. They were talking to what was supposed to be a safe person,
Mhm.
who is an extension you know, of God or, their higher power, whatever you want to say. And the level of betrayal,
Mhm.
I can't even imagine from a victim's perspective in this specific type of abuse.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you hit the right word there, and that is betrayal. Yeah.
Tim, I have a question. So I have a feeling that I'm not going to talk as much in this interview because this is it's a hard subject for everybody, but there's just something in my heart that just I don't do well. I just really, really don't do well with any sort of religious abuse. Now, the question that I want to try to ask or explore is, what is the process? And I'm going to try to say it as delicately but also directly as I can. In my mind, I can't imagine, like in your specific case, that all of a sudden one day, you know, it went from no interactions to all of a sudden one day you were in an office or in a setting with your priest and were being violently abused. So again, my question is there a grooming process? Is there a process in which you personally experienced or that other survivors have come forth and talked about? How does it get to that point?
Well, I think you hit again, you hit right on the nose as far as grooming. And the priest that raped me was an Irish guy. I grew up in an Irish neighborhood. He was very jovial and friendly and whatever. So predators cultivate, those things that are likable, sort of like why are clowns? A lot of them are predators. Well, they use that mask to gain access, as a means to gain acceptance and whatever. So you have a position of power and authority, and that's a great platform to groom. And
Mhm.
that's exactly what it is. It may be a dozen or 100 small actions that lead to sexual abuse, but it's part of grooming, and this is pretty consistent with adult predators too, of men that abuse
Mhm.
women. Adult women is, they're kind, they're jovial, a little presence and attention and whatever, but it's all part of a grooming process to exploit. And the priest that abused me, was a charming Irish guy, and he would come over to the house. My parents were very religious, and I came from a family of 12, and he would come over for dinner, or he'd have come over in the evening and have a drink with my dad. And so he was all very jovial and part of the family, and, you know, the parish priest.
Mhm.
So grooming is, incredibly effective. And, yeah.
Unfortunately. Yeah. And so one of the things that is really important for me to try to convey in this interview is for somebody who is listening to this, who is able to stomach this interview because it's tough. Maybe they don't know that they have experienced being groomed in the past, or maybe they're in the midst of it, or maybe they're subconsciously aware or maybe in denial that they're witnessing it within their congregation, within their, their church or what have you. Could you maybe provide us with some ideas of what are some of those signs and indications that somebody's being groomed?
Huh. I never thought about that. Um, yeah, I think I would approach it from a different viewpoint, and that is having confidence in yourself. In other words, sometimes grooming is an exploitation of some kind of weakness or vulnerability. And the more that someone can cultivate, their own self awareness and their own strength of characters, I think is a foundation for resisting. It's not like, yeah. And grooming can be exceptionally subtle. It can go over weeks, months, whatever. So I don't have a real answer other than saying having confidence in your own ability. And at the point of exploitation is, if you have that strength of character to step away and, you know, step forward with controlling your own life.
Mhm. Mhm. Tim, Bailey and I talked, I don't know, it was a couple weeks ago maybe. And Bailey has always been a little bit more standoffish. Her personality is a little bit more standoffish. She doesn't like physical touch. That's just kind of always been her personality from the time she was little. She wasn't a cuddler. I am the opposite. I don't have a problem, putting my hand on someone's shoulder when I'm talking to them, giving them a hug. And we got to talking about this idea of professional boundaries. right? And how Bailey was like in my field, because Bailey is a trauma therapist. She does specialize in things like substance abuse and also sex addiction. And she is very, very naturally good at drawing boundaries. There's no physical touch between her patient and her. And then as a professional, she feels that it is very, very important for her to maintain, again, a very professional boundary. Like I said, I, on the other hand, probably don't pick up if boundaries are being crossed. If somebody were to give me a hug, in a professional setting, I would just be like, oh, they're nice. And from what you're saying, kind of what I'm hearing is maybe do we need to do a better job of talking about and knowing what professional boundaries are within a school setting, a coaching setting, a religious setting. Do we need to teach and educate youth, other people? Those are boundaries that don't need to be crossed. These are, is that making
Yeah.
sense, Bailey?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, and there are organizations that develop programs exactly that. And I'd have to look up, and maybe you could send me an email with that question, and then I could send back a couple of resources, which I don't have right on hand.
That's fine, and we can always link it in our show notes for the listeners too.
But there are a couple of organizations that do have programs and graphics and, that address that exactly.
Yeah.
But
Mhm.
all through your little presentation there, Chelsea, is that I
My own
was
little soapbox.
no, 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 no. I was smiling because I have twin daughters, and one of my daughters, Fiona, is very strong-willed, very feisty, but very self-protective. She is armored. She is just as strong. Both my twins are 25. She's incredibly strong. When I went to meet with the bishop, Fiona came with me. So she's a very strong kind of individual, strong-willed. Both of them are incredibly bright. My other daughter, Maya, is just loquacious, whatever it is, talkative, social, embracing, feeling. She is all that, very, very social. Any person she meets, she's like my father. Any person she meets, she's friends with and wants to chat with. So I have two different daughters, and so I was smiling because, feisty Fiona, and then all embracing Maya, and that is my daughters, and both of
Mhm.
them bring gifts to this world. As I said, my daughter Fiona, when she was, what, 17, maybe 18, when I went back to challenge the bishop back in Iowa to talk about my abuse, she was my supporter, my advocate. She stood
Mhm.
right there and she called the bishop a liar. And she wrote like a 3-page response to the bishop. And she's not a girl that, or a young woman that writes, but she wrote 3 pages about all the harm that the abuse caused me. And oh, yeah, she was really feisty. So I totally understand, that there's different approaches in how we embrace the world.
Yeah.
So, but it's kind of continuing in this vein. Do you feel that that is something to be leery of if you have a person of power who is overly affectionate towards a person?
Oh, yeah, sure. Oh, yeah, of course. There's got to be boundaries. And, I mean, years ago, is like when I grew up, the local priest was, you know, welcome in your home or whatever, and being left with children was no big issue. But I think nowadays the people, parents are aware that
Mhm.
you don't leave children alone with the teacher or the coach or the priest. You don't leave them alone at the doctor's office or wherever, that there needs to be another level kind of protection. And of course, schools are beginning to initiate safety programs and things like that of awareness and that provides some kind of armor for children,
Mhm.
being more aware of what some of these issues are. When I was a kid, there's no such programs at all.
Right.
And I imagine that this is why, because this really got my wheels turning in my head, but I imagine this is why it's potentially more complicated within the church system, if you will, because there's a natural, how do I say this? It's not weird for a preacher or a priest or a deacon to hug a fellow parishioner, to hug a fellow parishioner's children, to, hold hands in prayer, to, tap into deep seated vulnerabilities because that's what you have to do to heal and that's what you have to do to connect, right, with the Father, the Son, or the Holy Spirit, or whatever the case is. And so I imagine that even the concept of boundaries can be highly manipulated, right, by predators in a church setting because just about any grooming behavior can really look like a preacher doing his or her job, loving their flock. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it
Mhm.
makes sense, but I disagree. I
Okay.
think that I think that people in power, ministers, priests, whatever, should not be hugging people. I mean, maybe holding hands or whatever. Should not be hugging, should not be having any kind of that kind of contact. In other words, you mentioned the issue of connection. And I think, physical connection is important in whatever for us as human beings, because what makes us human beings. We're social beings and whatever. And so I totally support in all forms connection. But given the history of sexual violence in America, where 1 out of 4 women, 1 out of 6 men are sexually abused, I
Mhm.
think that there needs to be a new culture which doesn't involve any kind of personal contact. Yeah.
Mhm.
And even within the family is, the uncle that is a little too squeezy or the aunt that gives um, many kisses, that what was acceptable in the past, um,
Yeah.
so I totally would not want to diminish connection in relationships and whatever. But to me, there needs to be incredibly clear boundaries,
Mhm.
especially since the awareness is still in the process of growing. In other words, there needs to be
Mhm.
a wider awareness of how this physical contact is part of grooming.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
And that includes teaching, our children that it's okay to set boundaries even with a preacher, a priest, a deacon, somebody in power and somebody in the state of
An
authority.
aunt or an uncle.
Right.
Yeah, but
Right.
the problem that I see, because I work with teenagers and I've also worked with abuse victims of all sorts as, when they grew up and they were adults. And the problem with this is most of our children kind of bell-shaped curve in our culture and society, even today, it's respect your elders. It's, making sure to follow the lead of, don't backtalk. It's, at least in the South, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, and that kind of stuff. And so sometimes it's the boundaries are counterintuitive depending on what pocketed culture you're in.
Mhm. Mhm.
I'm not saying it should be that way, but, how do you differentiate? Because we're trying to attack this root system with sexual abuse and especially in the context of clergy, but how do you teach a whole culture to not hug their deacon or, their preacher or the leader of the congregation or hold their hand in prayer when that has been so socially ingrained for tens or hundreds of years?
Well, I think I'm gonna interject in this just a little bit.
Please.
So, studies show that outside of the family unit, you need people, 5 people to help mold and raise children. And they show that for whatever reason, the number is 5. And I think I agree with Tim in that as a preacher, as a bishop, as a whoever you are, as a top tier in that hierarchy, I think that's where again, it needs to be made very clear that you don't need to be one of those 5 who are hugging or kissing. You can fist bump, you can high five. I mean, we go to church regularly, and that's what we see in our leadership is we see a lot of fist bumps, we see a lot of high fives. Now, again, I know that that doesn't cover the aunts and the other members who could also be predators, but as far as the argument on people in power, I do really respect that in our congregation, it is very much a high five or a fist bump. And then it's the friend's mom who will give you the side hug or who will be there to cry with you and sit with you and things like that. And I really appreciate, again, that dynamic that you can still be an affectionate, a loving culture, but you can also still have those very clear boundaries of, I am a male lead pastor, lead preacher. I'm going to need another person in the room. We can high five, we can bump, but we still need to have those boundaries set in place. And again, I think, Bailey, to hopefully not take over the conversation, Tim, excuse me, but Bailey, to kind of answer your question, I feel again that education, education is key. And doing things like this where it's like, it's okay. It's
Even
okay.
starting here.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And, it kind of makes me think of when we were talking with Dr. Feldman, where he was like, you don't have to have any proof. If you have a sneaking suspicion that something is going on, now his is in reference to Munchausen by proxy or medical child abuse, suspicion alone is enough to say, hey, we have something going on. And I think that's another thing that needs to be brought up and to be taught is, hey, if you have a suspicion that something is going on, even if you don't have proof, that's okay. That's okay to bring that forward. We give you permission to
Yeah.
talk about this and bring light to it.
Mhm.
Well, I think that, 20 years ago, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation or it wouldn't be part of the social conversation. 40 years ago, for sure, it's not. So
Yeah.
we could see that there's a trajectory to greater awareness about the issue,
Hmm.
which I think is a fantastic thing. And, at some point we'll reach even more kind of community awareness or whatever. And I
Hmm.
think to get back to the question of relationships is yes, yes, build all the relationships we can and the different kinds of ways of socially or culturally or through religious kind of connections. Um, but I do think that there needs to be strong and very strict kind of boundaries.
Hmm.
And maybe at some point, 40 years from now, they'll become less of an issue because
Yeah.
the community is more aware and there's more protections against exploitation and grooming, where there's more flexibility as far as connection.
And I do kind of mirroring the going back to the education, I worked at an all-male inpatient sex addiction facility, and kind of going back to the boundaries conversation, one interaction that sticks out to my memory is the gentlemen were coming into group. I'm holding the door. Good morning. How are you? Hello. Welcome. Glad you're feeling better. Good morning. And one of them came up and said, Miss Bailey, you have the most beautiful hair. And without skipping a beat, I said, why are you talking about my hair? Why is there any reason in this world for you to be complimenting me physically? Now, of course, I'm in a position that I have to be very cognizant of these interactions, but had I not been in that specific position, in that dynamic, in that kind of subculture of that inpatient facility, someone who came up to me and said, "I really love your hair. It's the most beautiful hair I've ever seen." I'd be like, "Oh my gosh, thank you so much."
Right.
Right? And I think that that is nobody walks into a place of worship or, Boy Scouts or football practice or, history class and an adult says, "Hey, did you get a new haircut? You look really sharp, man. That's really nice." And think that, "Oh, I'm being groomed by this adult."
Um,
Right? And so I think it's definitely to be able to be brave enough and bold enough to have these conversations, especially with our children and our teenagers, to help them understand like what is appropriate in which setting.
Correct. Oh, yeah, definitely.
So, Tim, as far as we've talked about abuse and we've talked about some statistics and we've talked about grooming, and you've talked a little bit about shuffling, right? And priests were shuffled around. Are we seeing that now that more things are being exposed, are churches starting to have policies on, this is our expectation? And are we starting to see any increase in reporting and um, legal
Like
ramifications?
repercussions
Yeah,
or
ramifications if it is found out in a religious setting.
Yeah. Well, I think, for instance, I gave the example of the church establishing the Charter for the Protection of Children,
Mm-hmm.
which was a thing they did in 2002 or 2004 or something like that. But the question isn't so much the institute policies is do they follow them?
Hmm.
And I would posit, I would suggest that whether it's Baptist or Catholic or Mennonite or Jehovah's, that any kind of policy is ineffective.
Hmm.
And what we found, my experience, my view, is that where we're going to see receive justice, where we're going to have safety of children, is from institutions outside of the church, outside of the
Hmm.
religious institutions. And
Hmm.
so we've seen, that there's through survivor advocacy, that there's changes in statute of limitation laws because
Mm.
for
Uh-huh. Oh, that's a good point. Statute of limitation laws. I hadn't even thought about that, Tim.
yeah, because like myself, it took 30 years for some memories to come forward. And
Right.
Child USA said the statistic for the average age of a victim of child abuse to come into memories of their abuse is 52. So most laws, statute of limitations law, prohibit victims of child abuse to even bring their case forward. We
Mhm.
even had a case of 9 little girls in South Dakota, which was 9 sisters, Indian sisters, who were transported off to a reservation school. Uh, all of them abused, 9 sisters. They attempted to achieve justice through South Dakota. And when they started to bring their case forward, the state legislature changed the law to prohibit these 9 sisters from taking action. So that because of the church and because of the power of the church or the power of insurance companies, they keep restricting. So anyhow, there's a contention, there's forces of good, survivors advocating for statute of limitation reform to get states to investigate. We've even attempted, well, with some success, getting the FBI to investigate. I can get
Hmm.
another side story about that. But um, so it's outside organizations that are ensuring the safety of children and of society. So I have
Kinda like a
no,
checks and balances system in a way.
yeah, but it's a political struggle. In other words, our movement is growing and developing more power and influence where we're changing statute of limitation laws or having states investigate or the FBI to investigate or the military to investigate. Um, but it's a tension. It's a sites of contention between existing people that want to maintain their power and, justice survivors on the other hand, trying to achieve justice.
Mhm.
So we're fighting huge institutions, not only the church and the Baptist and Hollywood and the Boy Scouts and the military, it's also insurance companies. And so there's a lot of struggles going on. In general, survivors are winning.
Mhm.
Just we haven't won yet.
Mhm. And speaking of survivors and, we wanna be respectful of your time. And so one of the big questions that I had, maybe my final question, is from your experience, how are victims of clergy abuse usually treated once an allegation is made public? And it doesn't have to be national news public, but public within their church or anything like that. Are the parishioners usually supportive or protective of the accused or of the victim? And so we've talked a lot about like the upper echelon, the bigger players in kind of covering this up. But laterally speaking, what have you found as far as colleagues or peers or parishioners, co-parishioners, I don't know how else you would say that, of victims?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, we have to keep in mind that one of the big interests of the Catholic institution or religious institutions is to keep things quiet, to hide
Mhm.
things.
Mhm.
So they especially want to hide, as I mentioned before, but to emphasize that the institution makes all sorts of efforts to hide the individual abuse or the scope of the abuse.
Mhm.
So
You're right.
that is an overlying pressure, if you will, that reduces the impact as survivors coming forward to parishioners.
Mhm.
But in my personal history, when I started doing stuff with SNAP in 1995, parishioners were by and large hostile. Like spitting at us, calling us names, calling us liars, saying we're anti-church, we're delusional, we're enemies, we're servants of Satan, all of that that we see this within the Catholic community because starting out,
And getting re-victimized.
yeah, I mean, I mean, for me at the time, I was with other survivors, and there's an incredible amount of power because their story is my story. So when I started out, not only were the priests in the hierarchy, individual parish priests hostile to us, calling the police on us. I don't know how many times that happened for demonstrating out front. But for us survivors, their story was my story. And so
Yeah,
I
yeah.
was in solidarity. There's a great amount of strength in knowing that I wasn't alone, that it wasn't my fault.
Yeah.
So it was, I don't want to say easy, but I had a great amount of power to resist any kind of outside threats, criticisms from parishioners at the time.
Mhm.
Um, but after, things that happened in Dallas, there's a huge newspaper articles about sex abuse in the church in Dallas.
Mhm.
There is, of course, the Spotlight series in 2002, 2003 in Boston. And after that, there was a number of different kinds of exposures of sexual abuse in the Catholic faith and within the institution and cover-ups and et cetera.
Mhm.
So people became more, well, definitely no more threats, became more sympathetic to it. But,
Mhm.
their response and most response of religious people now, parishioners, is it happened a long time ago. It's all over now. The church has solved all the problems.
Mhm.
I can't. I still hear that today, and it just drives me nuts because it's not over. The church is still complicit. The church is still covering up. But that's the parishioner's response. Oh, I'm sorry it happened to you. It happened a long time ago.
Mhm.
The church is doing something on it. Well, the church is not. But so that's kind of the response. There's Voice of the Faithful, and there's another organization that I can't remember now.
Mhm.
But there's two Catholic organizations, lay organization. Voice of the Faithful is one of them. I'll try to think of the other one.
You know,
But yeah,
and
there are prayers that speak up. Yes.
Mhm. I want to also say, I know this is kind of relevant slash, not relevant topic slash not on topic. The one thing that has stuck with me from the time you said it, and I think it was at the beginning of this interview, is unlocking memories. And I remember I just so happened to read a book. Bailey was the one who recommended it, and it was called The Body Keeps the Score by
Oh yeah,
Bess
yeah, yeah. No, he's
Wanda
famous.
Vanderpool.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Mhm.
And I am so glad that you talked on this idea of those memories didn't resurface until, fill in the blank, however many years later. Because in this book, that was the first time I had ever explored the concept of trauma and related to almost like memory loss, right? Like the
Oh
person just
sure.
flat did not remember. And I think a misconception, and one thing that I've heard, talking about Hollywood, sexual assault and things like that is, why would they just now be coming forward? Why 30 years later? Why 5 years later? Why 50?
Oh, it's such a good point. Yeah.
And I love that you touched on that. And I also, for those who are listening, I also, want to say, if you are, just now recovering or having memories that are coming up that were triggered for whatever reason, you're not a crazy person. This does happen. Our body will subdue or lock away these traumatic experiences, and they can resurface years later. So I don't, that's not really a question. I just wanted to say I'm so, so, so glad that you touched on that.
Well,
And
I'm
go ahead.
So I was just going to respond that I am of the belief that survivors have created a social movement, much like the women's movement or the civil rights movement,
Hmm.
um, and this is exemplified in changing behaviors, changing statute of limitation laws, initiating investigations. Hundreds of organizations have been formed, thousands of social media, like Instagram, Facebook,
Hmm. Hmm.
Twitter, survivor accounts, and survivors fight back.
Hmm.
And in every sector of society, there are survivor organizations. And for the listeners, I want them to know that there are organizations, whether it's the military or the Boy Scouts or women or
Hmm.
men or within the Catholic or Jehovah's or the Boy Scouts, or that there are organizations existing now that address the issue of sexual abuse, that do have programs to support victims of sexual abuse. Some of them take up advocacy, like SNAP does. We have
Hmm.
maybe 40 support groups every month, and we welcome all within the religious community, whatever. In fact, we have support groups around Baptists or Christian women or abuse as an adult or anyhow. There's a lot of resources, and I list quite a few organizations at standupspeakup.org, and they can
Hmm.
go there, or they can do a Google search. And if they're within a certain kind of community, a Baptist or Boy Scouts or whatever it is, and sexual abuse and organization, they can come up with some organizations that can provide support. um, so I want to make sure that people know that not only is there some information around sexual abuse, but there is some practical things that you could do to take up to address this, that you're not
Hmm.
alone and that there are
Hmm.
organizations out there that can provide support and help and resources
Hmm.
for you.
Hmm.
Yeah. And we'll make sure to list all of that in our show notes, and the one thing that I want to say to kind of piggyback off of that is, and I don't know why I feel like I need to say this. I just feel like I need to say this. If somebody who is listening has been a victim of sexual abuse or knows somebody who is a victim of sexual clergy abuse, you can find therapists that are not affiliated with your institution,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because a lot of families are guided and directed to going to
Yep.
kind of in-house therapy.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of therapists out there who may not um, share or promote that they are a quote unquote Christian therapist, but they do absolutely have an understanding of your belief system and can help you process through that. And they are not attached to the church, right? They are a separate entity, completely not involved, but they still can respect your boundaries around your belief systems and can help you process through that. So I just wanted to add that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Well, there's another resource, Psychology Today has a listing of
Mhm.
therapists, and you can, they have a great database, and you can select by a number of categories of what kind of therapist you're looking for. But I think, Bailey, that's a great idea. That's important to assess um, that because we don't want to have any other kind of influences crashing in on, your therapy. So,
Mhm. Yeah.
And we usually say, what can we do? We always try to end an interview of what can we do? And I am going to ask that question. But before I let you answer that question, because again, I just get so fired up on this, get involved, people. You know what I mean? Ask questions, stand up, research, and if you do know something, or if you even think that you know something, get involved, speak out. Like we have a Boy Scout in our household. My son is in Boy Scouts, and my husband goes with him on every event. He gets involved. He is not only there to protect him, but to also make sure that he doesn't see or hear or even have an inkling of anything like that.
Mhm.
I do the same thing within a school system. I do the same thing within my church because I know it's there, and I'm never going to be naive enough to think that it wouldn't happen to me or it wouldn't happen in my inner circle.
To
So,
be preventative as well instead of just reactionary, right?
right.
There are things we can do to be preventative in nature.
Right. So, Tim, I guess I'll now transition. What can we do? What more can we do to stand up, to speak up, to make sure that either it doesn't happen or that we are helping it once it happens? What can we do as civilians?
well, I think it takes a number of different points. One is, as you mentioned, children. And so, of course, you want to make sure that within your school, within your community, that there are programs that teach your children about appropriate touch and things like that. So
Mm.
that should be happening in your school. And if it's not, if they don't have a program, then they need to initiate that. The
Mhm.
other is that um, on sexual abuse is there are organizations, as I just remembered, I just mentioned. There are resources to investigate resources that can provide support. The other is um, there are legislation. In other words, talk to a legislator and make sure that um, they institute laws that provide safety for the community, provide justice for those that have been harmed, whether it's changing or reforming statute of limitation laws or
Mhm.
beginning
Yeah.
investigations of institutions.
Mhm.
So I think those are just a start of what we can do. But being involved, being aware is a starting point of any kind of social change.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I'm kind of at a loss for words, but
I'm about to
I
start a fire. Like I
Yeah.
Not literally gonna start a fire, but man, this gets me so fired up, Tim. Oh man, like this is such thank you so much for talking about this. And I was so nervous about talking about this because it is such a delicate subject. But Tim, you have enlightened me. You have done such an amazing job. And I know you're not looking for any sort of pat on the back, but thank you for being you. Thank you for the knowledge that you brought because I really am like, I'm gonna call my legislators. I'm gonna take
Good.
polls, and that is what should be invoked in people is a drive, a fire to change, to look at it, to see it, to recognize it, and then to take a step forward into change.
Yeah.
Right.
So thank
Yeah.
you for invoking that within me.
And thank you for sharing your story, and not just your professional expertise, but your personal story. I am just so grateful that you are at a space and a willingness to share that so that other individuals and other victims, past or current or future,
Mhm.
know that there is a way, that there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and that there is a whole community out there willing to support you and not shame you
Right.
and just provide you
Oh,
the guidance, protection, and love that you need. And so we just really appreciate the work that you do in this area that so many people do not want to touch with a 10-foot pole.
well, we live in a society where, you know, 1 out of 4 women are sexually abused. I mean, to me, that is so outrageous. And it touches all of us, whether it's a brother, a sister, a mother,
Mhm.
an aunt, an uncle, a child, that this is so prevalent within society. And
Yeah.
society needs to step up to address this, and that we should all be outraged by that and take this up to make sure that for me, what happened to me should not happen to another child, and that this should be a community response. And again, as I mentioned before, I believe that our society is changing and growing in awareness, and that's all a good thing. But have survivors know that there are resources, are help. Yeah,
So you guys look out for those resources in the show notes. If is there a place that listeners, if they want to connect directly with you, is there a way like on the Snap website that they can reach out directly to you? Are you open to that? Or
right. So Snap Network is their email or their website address is snapnetwork.org. Um, and they could write to the contact page there.
Mhm.
Or I have a website. It's called standupspeakup.org. And
Mhm.
you could write to me there at the contact. Uh, I welcome all communication and attempt to be very prompt in responding. Um, but again, there are hundreds of organizations that exist in all sectors of society, and that there are resources, there is help, and we can all get better.
well, thank you very much, Tim, for joining us here. We
Yeah.
really, really appreciate you, and we just thank you so much for sharing
Well,
with us today.
yeah, and thank you for raising the issue. As I
Absolutely.
mentioned, raising the issue is important to all to all the community, but especially to victims of sexual abuse is, knowing that they're
Mm.
not alone. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, Wild Side listeners, if you haven't heard it today, you are.
Loved, worthy, valuable, and we will.
Catch you on the flip side.
Bye,
Bye, guys.
guys.
Hey, Wildside Tribe, don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Wildside Podcast.
Make sure to tune in on Wildside Wednesdays. New episodes will drop each Wednesday at 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
We would love to hear from you. So if you have a wild case recommendation, email us at wildsidepodcast@gmail.com. That's wildside with a C. Or share your thoughts in the comments below.
As always, if you haven't heard it today, you're loved, you're worthy, and you're valuable. And we'll catch you on
The flip side.